On July 20th, 1969, the world woke up to the news of the United States reaching the moon, precisely the three astronauts who were part of the Apollo 11 mission: Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong. The event caused a huge sensation around the world, and America took the lead in the field of space exploration, especially after the Apollo 11 mission. 6 manned missions to the moon were launched, but strangely, since that time until today, all manned missions to the moon have stopped completely, raising many questions. Why, despite all the scientific progress we are experiencing today, has no one returned to the moon a second time, even though technology and equipment now would certainly make the task much easier than before? In order to understand why there have been no manned missions to the moon since 1972, we need to know why America decided to travel to the moon in the first place. Was it because of scientific research and benefiting people, for example? In fact, the answer is no. The main motive for America to send humans to the moon was to prove its superiority over the Soviet Union in front of the whole world. After the end of World War II, all the participating countries were completely exhausted from the war, and of course, the global economic situation was very difficult, with the exception of only 2 countries, America and the Soviet Union. For this reason, these 2 countries were in constant conflict over who would take absolute sovereignty and dominance over the world. Since both the Soviet Union and America were on the same side during the war and both were part of the Allies, with treaties and agreements between them, it was not possible for them to engage in military conflict with each other. For this reason, the idea of the Cold War emerged, where each country would prove its superiority in all fields over the other, and one of these fields was the space race. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched the satellite Sputnik 1 into orbit around the Earth for 3 months. This was the first artificial satellite in human history, and a huge event that proved the Soviet Union's technological superiority over the world. 1 month later, in November of the same year, the Soviet Union also put a dog named Laika in a spacecraft and sent her into orbit around the Earth with sensors to measure her heart rate, blood pressure, and many other things. The goal was to know the effect of the space environment on living creatures. Would the Soviet Union stop there? Of course not. In 1959, they sent a mechanical spacecraft called Luna 3 to space to photograph the far side of the moon. This is because from Earth, we always see one side of the moon due to a scientific phenomenon called tidal locking. After about 2 years, specifically in April 1961, the Soviet Union put a person inside a spacecraft, the pilot Yuri Gagarin, and left him orbiting the Earth for 100 minutes. Thus, he remains the first human to be sent into space in human history. It is true that America had some achievements in space at that time, the space race, such as launching some satellites and sending chimpanzees into orbit, but for the general scene, the Soviet Union's overwhelming superiority was clear. America's position was very weak, and it needed to do something that would make it surpass the Soviet Union. This is why America and Kennedy, the President of America, needed something strong to restore their confidence in themselves and the people's confidence in them. This is what made Kennedy say in his speech on September 12, 1962, "We choose to go to the moon. We will send a man to the moon and bring him back safely." He asked the government to support NASA with the money and equipment it would need to achieve this goal before 1970. The Apollo mission was a matter of life or death for America, as it was the thing that could restore America's prestige in the world. For this reason, they wanted to reach the moon at any cost, no matter how much money they would spend, and they were willing to endure difficult economic conditions. However, the project succeeded. The Apollo mission was literally America's national project, and for this reason, NASA's budget in 1965 was 4.3% of the total federal budget, which is a very large number. This made the Apollo mission available to them, equivalent to $264 billion in today's money, in addition to political, government, and media support. But what does all this have to do with no one returning to the moon again? Firstly, NASA's budget currently represents about 0.5% of the total U.S. budget, which means that NASA's budget in the 1960s was 9 times its current budget, and this is not enough to make safe trips to the moon. At the same time, the United States has proven its dominance in the space race for a long time, and the space issue is settled in favor of America, especially since the Soviet Union, which was America's fierce competitor, was dismantled in 1991. Therefore, the United States has nothing to push them to spend huge amounts of money again to travel to the moon. What will they prove with that? At this time, they were able to spend much less money and achieve great accomplishments. You can imagine that the Apollo mission we talked about cost more than $264 billion, while the James Webb Space Telescope, which was launched in 2022 and made a big splash in the world, cost $10 billion, and I wish America alone had paid the $10 billion. The project is in partnership with 14 countries, including Austria, Belgium, Canada, Germany, and the UK. From an economic point of view, sending humans to the moon again is a mission that has no benefit. Let's clarify an important point. Sending humans to the moon is completely different from sending machines. Since 1972, trips carrying machines to the moon have not stopped. For example, in 2007, Japan launched the Selene spacecraft, and 1 year later, in 2008, India launched the Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft. Then, in 2013, China sent the Chang'e 3 spacecraft, which successfully landed on the moon's surface. After that, in 2018, they launched the Chang'e 4 spacecraft, and 2 years later, in 2020, they launched the Chang'e 5 spacecraft, which was able to take samples of moon rocks and soil and return them to Earth. This means that trips to the moon have not stopped, only trips carrying humans have stopped. Trips carrying machines are relatively easy and do not involve many risks. However, on the contrary, trips carrying humans require huge amounts of money and a great deal of effort to provide safety precautions with extreme accuracy, such as maintaining the temperature inside the spacecraft, maintaining pressure inside the spacecraft, protecting humans from radiation, providing a sufficient amount of oxygen, and providing necessary food and water throughout the trip, no matter how long it takes. All of these things make the trip carrying humans very complicated, and even disposing of waste from astronauts inside the spacecraft is a complex issue. Despite all these precautions, the rocket carrying the astronauts may explode, or the spacecraft may experience a malfunction while in space. Instead of the mission being a political victory for the country that carries it out, it could become a disaster and a huge embarrassment. This is exactly what happened in 1970 during the Apollo 13 mission, where the oxygen tank of the spacecraft exploded, and there was a malfunction in the electricity generators. The 3 astronauts who were on board were at risk of death, and for this reason, when the spacecraft reached the moon's orbit, the mission was canceled, and they returned to Earth, where they made a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, which was a very significant event. Currently, all space agencies have a different strategic idea than in the past. Current space agencies see that all the money spent on the Apollo missions was a misuse of funds and technology. In other words, it was possible to use all this money to build a complete system that transports humans into space in a way that resembles transportation methods. This means that we could have a station on Earth and another station in space, and we could make rockets and vehicles that have the ability to travel between the 2 stations more than once. With the huge amount of money spent on the Apollo project, it was possible to create such a system. However, no one thought of this because their only concern was to defeat the Soviet Union as quickly as possible. But currently, This is the goal that space agencies and private companies such as SpaceX are striving for. They are trying to manufacture vehicles that can transport humans into space and return them to Earth repeatedly and sustainably.